Bibles and turn with me to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7. Now I'm going to read beginning in verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea, and four great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand upon the earth, or upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second, like to a bear, and it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I beheld, and lo, another like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it, and it was diverse from all the other beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Now I'm going to pause there, probably read later on in the message, but we come to that point now in our series of prophecy studies out of Daniel to the 4 beasts that Daniel saw in a vision. Now keep in mind that God's great desire is for you to know what is going to happen and where you are in time. We may ask that question, what time is it? We can pretty well answer it when we put all prophecy together. You see, God gets the glory for this. Of course, Satan tries his best to cause confusion, first in Genesis, that first book, and in the last book, Revelation. And you say, why? Why does he tell people not to read the book of Revelation because you can't understand it? Why does he not want you to read the book of Genesis? Because that's all confusing with the creation and all that. Because in the book of Genesis, God prophesies his destruction. And in the book of Revelation, we see it coming true. And he likes to cloud that all up so that you don't understand it. And so he says, you see, Daniel and Revelation is just a bunch of, symbols that no one can understand what they mean. This is not true, folks. Keep in mind, this is a little saying you can remember. Daniel is the ABCs of prophecy. Revelation is the XYZs of prophecy. Now, are those the only 2 prophetic books? No. All through the Old Testament, we have prophetic books. But when we come to Daniel, it's a precise prophecy that points to the end days, and particularly the great tribulation period which is yet to come. Now, those of you who know something of God's calendar of events know that the next great event is the rapture of the church. Rapture of the church. Does anybody, well, I'm going to just pause here, don't have a chart that I can quickly get to you? You have one? All right, and I will say that next week the other charts that I have prepared to help you understand that we didn't have this morning will be there, and those listening by tape, of course, you get all the charts as well. God tells Daniel at the end of this book, he says, seal up the prophecy until the time of the end. In other words, no one's going to understand what you wrote until the time of the end. He tells John, though, in the book of the Revelation, seal not the book, for the time is at hand. So we see all these are for the end time, and it is an amazing thing. Until about the beginning of the 20th century, preachers, Bible scholars did not know what the book of Revelation said, and it's still only a few do today. The rest of it puts their own spin on it, according to their own theological ideology, I guess would be the proper words. Because we do have millennialists, and we have liberals, and we have all kinds of labels on people and their ideology. We come down to fundamental Scripture, though, and we understand what it means. Now, without Daniel, Revelation cannot be understood. As we get into Revelation, for instance, you will understand that there is a beast in the 13th and the 17th chapter, which is on the other chart, by the way. And it is a composite of these four beasts that I have drawn here. You put them all together and it makes one beast in the book of the Revelation. So without Daniel's four beasts, you couldn't understand what the beast is in Revelation. And when we get to Revelation, by understanding how it all fits together, it will be very clear for you. So you just hang on. And but get these basic lessons first in Daniel. All right, as you note, as I have drawn there in chart 3, you'll see that these four beasts correspond to that great image, that great dream of Nebuchadnezzar, which speaks of the Gentile kingdoms found in the 2nd chapter of Daniel. There is a correspondence. First, you have the head, and that's the head of gold, which stands for the Babylonian Empire, Nebuchadnezzar himself. Now this starts about 606 BC. And you remember from last week, God said, now, as Israel and Judah both went into captivity, he says, now the kingdom of this world will be given over to the Gentiles. And there will be 4 worldwide kingdoms until the coming of the 5th kingdom. And that 5th kingdom is going to be the stone kingdom representing Jesus Christ. So there will be 4 worldwide kingdoms until Jesus Christ comes the second time. And that first is the head of gold. And that, of course, head of gold corresponds to the first beast that Daniel sees here, which is the lion, has wings of eagles. Now, how do we know this is the Babylonian Empire, you might say? Well, God tells us, plus history tells us. It's amazing, if you've ever been in England and gone to the British Museum, you will find this winged lion in the museum that they got from Babylon. It was their national, seal, so to speak. And it's there today. And so the gold and the beast here represents the same. You may say, why is God telling us the same thing 2 different ways? Well, he gave the first, that is, that great Colossus dream to Nebuchadnezzar to show how man thinks. One glorious kingdom after the other of man. And through Daniel, in his vision, he gives the same information over through beasts, just one beast devouring another beast. So he sees the nations of man, just one beast devouring another beast. until finally you get down to a beast that no one can even describe. And so this lion with a wings of an eagle stands for the Babylonian Empire. And then you have the chest and the arms, which is silver, stands for that which defeated the Babylonian Empire, and that was the Medo-Persian Empire. And then you have the belly, which is silver, and that stands for Alexander the Great in his conquering Grecians. I'm sorry, that's brass. The silver is in the chest. The brass is the belly. Then we come to iron. We come to Rome, beginning in 63 BC. The lower torso, and then it spreads out into two legs. As we look at history, we see that under Constantine, and thereabout, roughly 2nd century, we get into a position where the Roman Empire, they got into a position, I should say, where the true church married into paganism and created a worldwide church, which is still in existence today. And the Caesars of those times, so they actually served a dual role. They served as Caesar over the Roman Empire politically, and they served as Pope or Pontiff, as they called it then, over the Roman Church. These two went together until finally, you see, the political portion of the Roman Empire fell, but the ecclesiastical portion went forward, and they also took upon the semblance of a church. Until even today, you have both a church and a kingdom or a state. I think at one time in our history, even our government had representatives to the Vatican, political representatives, but other countries send also representatives to the Vatican. So they are a state. They had their own army. They still have their own army, as a matter of fact, but it's confined now to the Vatican. They were at one time throughout all Italy until they were defeated by a man named Garibaldi and brought and told to stay only within the confines of that small area. But they are still politically a church or a state as well as a church. Now the legs divide. I'm just kind of going over what we went over last week. I want you to see this. To west and to east. And as time continued, there were two empires, or two capitals of the same empire, one in Constantinople and one in Rome. And for so many years, one would be supreme and reign over the other, and then the other would be supreme and reign over the other. And at times they were equal. And it's interesting in history watching this empire, which is in two legs now, in two capitals, as it continues in time. And so, we see as it comes down to the toes, to the feet first of all, and then to the toes. And then the 10 toes that stand for 10 kingdoms, which has not yet been formed. For this iron became mixed with iron and clay, and you'll remember that the metals of the body stands for the purity of the government. Gold was the highest purity. And then silver, and then they began to bring in senates and other people. But starting at Nebuchadnezzar, there was no senate. There was no one else to tell him what to do. It was pure, you might say, autocratic government. A pure, you might say, dictatorship totally and completely. Man sees that as gold, then silver, then brass. When you get down into brass, you get Alexander. He had certain people that told him what to do back in Greece as well. influential. When you get into iron, you had a Roman Senate. You get into clay. Clay stands for democracies. People ruling. And people never make laws to rule themselves, by the way. That's why it's the weakest in God's eyes. Now we're living just before the day. This world will be split up throughout the whole world out of, I don't know how many nations we have now. Over 100 nations in this world, and will be split up. They'll all come together, be split up in this one worldwide kingdom, and there will be 10 kings that will be set over it. And we saw last week how the world now is coming to that point. Even our own government speaks of the one world government that they're working for and towards. And we have divisions like NATO and United Nations and so forth and so forth. It's coming to that, folks. But when it comes totally, it will be then broken into 10 kingdoms. What we're seeing now is staging only. Now, where the clay starts in the image is at the French Revolution. The French Revolution was the first time in the history of man to really have a pure democratic government. One nation, and now there are hundreds that have democratic government. God counts that the worst kind. The first beast is likened unto gold. He's a lion with wings. It stands for the nature and the quality of the government of Babylon. The lion is the king of the beasts. The eagle's wings is the king of the birds. And there was no one greater at that time until the wings were plucked. Nebuchadnezzar beginning to lose his power, and then finally he stood up on his feet and a man's heart was given to him. This speaks of him personally, and particularly after he came back from that 7 years of insanity. And then they were defeated by the Medo-Persian Empire. You know, in studying history, this is one of the most amazing ways that they defeated another. You know, Babylon, the city of Babylon, as I've said often here from the pulpit, was probably one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The walls itself, hundreds of feet high, and there were 2 of them, and you could race abreast down the top of the walls. Chariots, and they described so many that it would be almost like a 4-lane highway, one of our 4-lane highways that you could put down the top. No one could get through. It was impregnable. They could even raise their own food on the inside. But there was a river that flowed through it, the Euphrates. And it had gates at the water. So the water actually went under the gates, but the gates went down into the water, but they didn't go all the way to the bottom. And the Medo-Persian Empire, Cyrus and Darius, one an uncle, the other a nephew, 2 nations that came together. That's why we call it the Medes and the Persians. They had gained great power in the world. And what they did is that they actually dammed up the river way out of sight over a period of, during the summer months, I should say, and they diverted the water into a great reservoir, so that most of the water was diverted and the water line at the palace went down below the gates. And then the soldiers just marched down the river bottom, possibly water up to their knees, under the gates, went into the city and captured it. Now that's historically how they did it. And yet it's all mapped out there in Isaiah, and God actually suggests how it would happen even 150 years before it did happen. Part of prophecy. Now the Medo-Persian Empire here is signified by a bear. A bear with 3 ribs in his mouth. And this is an alliance, this ribs, of Egypt, Babylon, and Lydia. 3 nations that came together as an alliance against this slow-moving bear. You say it was slow-moving? Yes. You see, the armies of the Persians, sometimes when they went, it was as many as 2,500,000 men. Can you understand this, that they had more men generally in one battle than we had in the whole Second World War? And there was probably another 2 million camp followers and supply lines. That's why God looks upon this nation as a bear. Slow, lumbering, nobody can stop it type of country. And it says here that it raised up on its right side, which corresponds to the right arm of the image, which is Persia, out of this alliance between the Medes and the Persians. It was the strongest of the two. Now Daniel is seeing this all in a vision. He doesn't know what it means. God's going to show him what it's going to mean. But he doesn't know yet. He says, arise and devour much flesh in verse 5. Wherever it went, it took everything in the land because there were so many people. There was no food even left for the people who lived there. They just took everything. And then after this, in verse 6, there was a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl, and the beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. This stands for Alexander the Great and the Grecian armies. And Alexander, if you'll remember your ancient history from school, died after he'd conquered the world of that day. And his kingdom was split up into 4 of his generals, which the 4 heads stand for. Later on, God's going to deal with 2 of these heads in another vision and break it down to 1 head. And then have some horns come up on that head and a little horn coming up speaking great things. And the reason he does this is he wants us to know who the Antichrist is and where he's going to come from. But he hadn't gotten to those details as of yet. Right now, he's showing us, though, the Grecian empires. The 4 wings probably stands for the 4 corners of the earth. Do you remember this was that great general that sat down and cried because he didn't think there was any more of the world to conquer? You say, how can a lion conquer a bear? Well, when you go back in history and see the military movements, you can understand. Alexander the Great had tactics that was far beyond what the bear had, that is the Medo-Persian Empire. And, of course, part of his tactics was speed. The leopard is very fast as opposed to the slow bear. And he defeated an army 5 and 6 times bigger than him and drove back the Medo-Persian Empire. Defeated them twice on the field of war, battle. And then later on captured the Medo-Persian Empire along with Egypt and along with Assyria and all of that, even as we say the Pleasant Land, well, right between 2 of his generals who will later on fight. His name is Ptolemy and the other general Seleucia, or the Assyrians and the Egyptians, and their fight will be over the Pleasant Land, or will be over Israel. That will be their battleground. But right now, it's necessary for you to see that God likens this 4-headed leopard as to the brass. And then he comes to a beast that no one can describe. And I didn't know how to describe it when I had this drawn. I told my artist, I says, you draw something that looks terrible. And so that's the best thing he could come up with. So we don't know what it looks like. Here's what Daniel says in verse 7. And after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces and stamped the residue with the feet of it, and it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Beloved, this represents the Roman Empire beast. It represents the iron in it, shows us that this is the Roman Empire. And it has 10 horns on its head, which represents the 10 kingdoms that's going to arise. Now you need to understand that the Roman, I should put it this way, the Holy Roman Empire today actually controls the whole world and all the nations in it, mixed with clay democracies. The time is coming when, after the rapture of the church, Antichrist will make his move. He will be revealed as a great savior of this society, and he will bring in a false peace for 3.5 years, and he will solve every problem in the world, and everybody will be saying peace and safety. And then, according to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, when they say peace and safety, sudden destruction falleth upon them. That's the beginning of the last 3.5 years of the tribulation period. It's called in Daniel a time, times, and the half a time. So when you read that in the 7th chapter of Daniel, you'll know what area God is speaking of. Time, times, and a half a time. 1 year, 2 years, and a half a year. It's also known in the Hebrew text as the time of Jacob's trouble. It's Jacob's trouble manifested in these last days. Now, these 10 toes have not yet appeared. The stage is set. Then the 10 toes will appear. And then 3.5 years later, there will be a little horn that'll come up on these 10 toes. A little horn. Actually, he comes up on the 10 horns on the beast, not on the toes itself. Just one represents the other. And a little horn will come up speaking great blasphemies. Now you say, is this the beginning of Antichrist? No, this is the beginning of the little horn, which is in the last 3.5 years. And it corresponds to what Revelation calls the beast. Antichrist has already ended his first 3.5 years. There's going to be an assassination according to Scriptures, and he will come back alive, but he won't be the same person because he will be incarnated by Satan. And whereas he was the type where everybody was following him in the first 3.5 years, he was great and charismatic and a great orator and solved all problems, and everybody loved him and thought that he was the Christ, particularly Jews. Therefore they call him, the Scriptures call him there the Antichrist. But the last 3.5 years he changes and he's called the beast. That's what this little horn represents. I want you to notice the little horn does not come up with the 10 horns. The 10 horns are already there when the little horn comes up, showing that this world has already been split up into 10 kingdoms. Now you stop and think about that for a minute. I know this really grabs me a little bit. Oh, this whole world with all the hundreds of nations throughout the world. Hundreds of them. And new ones being formed every day, by the way. Are all going to be erased. All our national boundary lines. All erased. And Antichrist is going to split it all up and say there's only going to be 10 kingdoms in this whole world. And it's going to be under the so-called Holy Roman Empire, because they're everywhere anyway. They're going to be the 10 toes that comes off of that one kingdom that's split. One represents the Roman Church, we call today the Catholic Church. The other represents the Eastern Orthodox Church, or the Greek Orthodox Church, and also the Russian Orthodox Church comes off of the other foot. One is a leg or a foot that is set in Asia and the other in Europe. Now the rest of the world is also part of that when the 10 toes are formed, because they're also throughout the whole world. Throughout the whole world. Now, this fourth beast is dreadful, exceedingly strong, great iron teeth, standing for the Roman Empire. It devoured, it brake in pieces. They tell me that the Roman Empire and its army was the cruelest it has ever been. And they said Adolf Hitler and his stormtroopers would look like pikers alongside them. History bears that out. They ruled by sheer terror. And here we have the Roman Empire in its final stages, where we're living today, folks. We're in the feet of iron and democracies, which is clay. The stage is set for the 10 toes to start. The stage is set for the 10 horns to grow. And 3.5 years later, a little horn is going to come up speaking great things. Now let's look at this in verse 8. I considered the horns. They're already there now. And behold, there came up another of them, among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth speaking great things. Now we have the beginning of this little horn. And he's literally going to take 3 of these nations that's been formed and pluck them up. We don't know who they are. We have some ideas, but you can't say from the pulpit, we know who this is, and it's this, and it's this, and it's this. We don't know. People do speculate, but we don't know, because we don't even know who the 10 kings are going to be yet. All right. We won't be here, folks, if you're a believer. We're going to be looking over the parapets of heaven, watching it all happen. Some people say, well, I know America's going to be one of the kings. America may be part of one of the kings, because the whole world's going to be divided into 10 kingdoms. Maybe only a part of America be in one kingdom and a part of America be in another kingdom. We don't know. But when Antichrist comes, he's going to seek to change times and seasons and occasions, these that are ordained by God himself. All right, here we see him speaking great things. This is the last part of the 3.5 years. This little horn. He's speaking blasphemy. Now, verse 9. I beheld till thrones were cast down. The word in the Hebrew is set. I beheld till thrones were set. And the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like the pure wool. His throne was like fiery flame, and his wheels as the burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. Thousands ministered unto him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The judgment was set, and the books were opened. Now we get a view of heaven. This speaks of the middle portion of the tribulation period. Daniel sees a vision of thrones being set. I want you to notice there's nobody in them yet. And I want you to notice that the books were open. And there's only 2 times books are opened in judgments in the Bible. One at the judgment seat of Christ, and the other at the great white throne of judgment at the end of the millennium. Books means judging according to works. These are opened also here to judge works. There's been all kind of controversy as to who he's talking about here. I think it is probably pointing to the time that the judgment seat of Christ is going to be in heaven, and at the same time, while he's judging the true church, in heaven. He is judging the false church on earth. These thrones that are set down are for those who gain the reward that will rule and reign with him. The fiery stream that issues and comes forth from before him, you'll find in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where it speaks of the baptism of fire. Now we continue here in verse 11. I beheld then, because of the voice of the great words which the horn spake. Now, this is literally devil incarnated in the man, called the beast in Revelation, here called the little horn. In Isaiah, he's called the Assyrian. In 1st or in 2nd Thessalonian, he's called the willful one. He's called the wicked one, and he's called the willful king. He is now speaking blasphemies to God, and as we put it together in Revelation, you'll see he'll be sitting in the temple with an image of himself, making the whole world bow down and worship this image of himself. Over in Matthew chapter 24, when God begins to speak of this time coming, he pauses a little bit and he says, as that which happened in Daniel, let him that heareth understand it. He's talking about the middle of the week, or the middle of the 7 years. When this happens, there in the 24th of chapter of Matthew, he says, run, get out of there, don't even come back to collect anything. For this is the man that turns into the beast. Next week, I promise I'll have those charts for you so you can be seeing it. It's all charted out for you. I spent a lot of time on them. And of course, those on tape ministry, the charts will go right out with the tapes. Now, I beheld, verse 11, then because of the voice of the great words which the horn spake, I beheld even till the beast was slain. That's the fourth beast that represents the Holy Roman Empire. Did you know that the book of Revelation, when it speaks of this, says that all of their churches and their peoples will be killed in the middle of the tribulation period? Antichrist don't want to give them anything anymore. He wants it all for himself. We'll get to that later on, but I will reference that to you now in the 17th chapter of the book of the Revelation. This is what Daniel sees here, though. And this false system, the beast, which is in its latter time, the Holy Roman Empire, is literally destroyed in the burning flame. At the end of the 3.5 years, then, we see in verse 13, I saw in night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and language should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, in his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. This is Jesus Christ, beloved. This is the vision we see in heaven of him coming to receive his kingdom and to come back. And beloved, it corresponds to that stone that will come, and it will strike that great colossus. And Daniel says that great image standing for all the kingdoms will just crumble immediately. And the wind of the air of the earth will just take away the shaft, blow it away. There'll be nothing left. We get into the book of Revelation, we'll understand that all of the great cities of this world will fall with the greatest earthquake on record. Not local, but the whole world when Jesus comes back. Revelation says the great cities of the world will fall. Now, if you can imagine Rome, New York, Los Angeles, London, Tokyo, all those cities fallen, so there's nothing left to them. What about the medium-sized cities and the little cities? And Isaiah tells us in his book that the world is going to stagger like a drunken man, the coming of the Lord. It's going to be interesting what the Richter scale reads in those days. It's possible it could be as high as 100. It won't be worldwide. Beloved, this corresponds to the image falling. The kingdoms of this world will fall. And man's utopia will be destroyed. And Jesus will set up his kingdom. And he will rule and reign. And the scriptures here say that when he comes, a kingdom will be given to him, that all people and nations and languages should serve him. And his dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. Oh, beloved, he won it on the cross. He paid for it on the cross. Now he's taken over in prophecy. Will you be ready? Will you be ready? The only way you can be ready is to be in heaven and coming back with him to rule and reign with him. And the way that you make sure of that is to trust him as Savior. The scriptures make it very clear how a man becomes saved. Just believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and thou shalt be saved. And you can know you're saved